While another cabinet nominee is the subject of a closed meeting, Health and Human Services Secretary nominee Tom Daschle faces questions on back taxes he recently paid. That meeting of the Senate Finance Committee will start at 5 Eastern Time today, led by Max Baucus. The Washington Post reporting on the story today says Thomas Daschle, fighting to defend his nomination to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, released a letter early today, apologizing to the top lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee for mistakes on his personal income tax returns that resulted in $146,000 in back payments. In the letter, the former Senate Majority Leader and close ally of President Obama provides a 7-month timeline recounting how and when he says he discovered a series of mistakes in the previous 3 years' returns. Again, that from Washington Post today. Again, we're in a short break on this Commission on Wartime Contracting hearing. Our live coverage continuing in just a few moments on C-SPAN.
Can I get you all to work towards your seats, please? Thank you. Okay, as just to share protocol, we're going to hear the testimony of the Mr. Bowen, Inspector General Bowen, Special IG for Iraq Reconstruction. We're going to take 2 rounds of questions, and hopefully then all of us will have much greater insight into the work. As a way of introduction, right, okay. My reminder is I did a mental lapse already. We have statements from each of the other commissioners, and then we'll do exactly what I said we'd do. And the first statement is by Commissioner Ervin. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be mercifully brief, I promise. I want to begin by noting that I regard it as a high honor and a great privilege to have been appointed by Speaker Pelosi to this critically important position. And it's been a pleasure to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and each of my fellow commissioners since our inception. And I look forward to continuing our work together until we deliver our final report next year. I commend the senators from whom we've heard this morning for their leadership on the issue of wartime contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, I commend each of the inspectors general from whom we will be hearing for their dogged efforts not only to uncover past incidents of waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, but equally importantly, to devise recommendations that, if implemented, will ensure that these incidents are not repeated in the future. I know from my own experience as Inspector General of both the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security how vital such oversight is in correcting past mistakes and avoiding future ones. I especially commend the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, my longtime friend and fellow Texan Stuart Bowen, and his team for their extraordinary work, the extraordinary work that they've done over the years, which culminates today, of course, in the release of Hard Lessons. It is without a doubt the most comprehensive, insightful, and compelling account to date of how our government's contracting efforts in Iraq went awry. But unless its lessons are taken to heart by policymakers and government managers today, it will be merely a history book, an unusually interesting and well-written history book, to be sure, but a history book nonetheless. It falls in large part to us commissioners to ensure that the hard lessons teaches us are learned and applied once and for all. We are downsizing our presence in Iraq today, but at the same time we are scaling up our efforts in Afghanistan. If we are not careful, we will repeat the same mistakes there that we have made in Iraq. Indeed, we have seen some instances of this already. Whether we like it or not, the fact is that America will be involved in contingent operations for the foreseeable future, and no doubt long after that. This being so, it is critical that we assess whether the United States government is properly structured to carry out the attendant logistical, reconstruction, and security functions. We must assess also whether our government has the necessary resources to carry out these functions, including the key question of whether our reliance today on contractors has gone too far. I'm especially concerned about the increasing privatization of war fighting and post-conflict reconstruction and development. But it is not just a question of organization charts and budgets, as important as both are. There's also the question of political will and filling key decision-making slots with people who fervently believe that accomplishing our war-fighting and post-conflict missions on the one hand, and eschewing waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement on the other, are not incompatible with each other, and that one imperative need not and should not take precedence over the other. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the estimable witnesses before us today and to listening to their answers to our questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Ervin. Commissioner Dov Zakheim, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was an honor to be appointed by President Bush to this commission, as was Grant Green, who unfortunately isn't here and has done a terrific job as acting co-chairman of the commission. And it's a pleasure to be working alongside so many very talented people who have devoted a lot of time to this already. As the senators have already made clear, the commission has a very important mandate. Our job is to build on the work that's already been undertaken to address the shortcomings of our contracting system writ large and apply the lessons we've learned to future American contingencies that most certainly are going to involve a major reliance on private contractors for a host of military support operations and activities. In addition, we face the urgent task of providing guidelines for our efforts in Afghanistan. As our military presence in that country ramps up, so will the presence of our contractors, and it's imperative we don't repeat the mistakes that were made, especially in Iraq. Now, I served in DOD at the outset of both major conflicts in which we now are still involved. As Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, I dispatched a team of auditors from the Defense Contract Audit Agency, which was a part of my organization, to Iraq during the early weeks of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I also served as DOD's coordinator for civilian operations in Afghanistan until my departure in 2004. So I'm intimately familiar with many aspects of the issues that Inspector General Stuart Bowen and his team from both his team and those from other agencies, for whom I have tremendous respect and worked with, will address today. As the path-breaking report that we've heard about already makes very clear, our government was simply unprepared for the massive challenge that the reconstruction of Iraq entailed. In my view, this was the case in no small part because we, the United States, have never had, and we're unlikely ever to have, the equivalent of a British colonial office. And it's in part for this reason that while the State Department may have prepared a massive how-to program for governing Iraq, it perhaps should have come as no surprise that pre-war planning was sporadic and too frequently ignored. It's arguable for similar reasons that we underestimated the troops needed to conduct post-war operations in Iraq. The high troop estimates were not meant to account for many tasks, such as logistical support, that contractors subsequently undertook. They were intended, and like the later and successful surge proved, to provide for additional security in an unstable environment. Again, the lessons of the past, stretching as far back as the Philippine insurrection of the early 20th century, were simply forgotten or never really understood. We've learned many bitter lessons from the Iraq experience, and our purpose here is to explore those lessons, uncover others, and apply them not only to our current efforts in Afghanistan, but also to future undertakings whenever and wherever they might arise. And it's crucial in this context that we explore in depth all aspects of the contracting system, and this includes how the Department of Defense in general and the military in particular is organized, trained, and equipped to manage contractors and the contracts that govern their activities. It involves the supervision of contractors, including foreign contractors, an issue that's perhaps become even more acute in Afghanistan than it's already been in Iraq. In closing, I wish to thank the witnesses for their cooperation and for the briefings which their agencies have already provided to us and to the Commission staff. I look forward to your testimony today, and I'd reiterate that our mission isn't to cover ground already that's been gone over but instead to distill the most important lessons so that we can efficiently and cost-effectively benefit from the contracting support that we're certainly going to require not only in Afghanistan, but in future operations for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. Commissioner Linda Gustitis, please.
Thank you. I'm also very honored to serve on the Commission. We're almost 7 years into the military operation in Afghanistan and 6 years into the military operation in Iraq. So one question we're going to have to address is, when does contingency contracting stop and normal procedures take over? I don't know if we still use the term contingency contracting for this. The SIGER report today, Hard Lessons, addresses an almost staggering number of issues and problems: poor contracting practices, inadequate staffing, inexperienced staffing, goals beyond our capabilities, changing missions, a shocking lack of planning, and so on. I'm particularly concerned about 3 issues identified in this report that are somewhat overarching: the lack of security, the lack of coordination, and the failure to involve the Iraqis. None of these issues was unknown to the administration, either before the invasion or after, and so the failure to address them in a reasonable time frame wasn't really out of ignorance, I'm afraid. It may have been arrogance or ideology, I don't know, but it wasn't ignorance. The administration knew from the very beginning that security was going to be a major problem. I have a written statement, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to put in the record in its entirety. But in my written statement, I identify some of the many warnings the SIGER report cites, including the fact that 1 month before the invasion, the military and civilian agencies involved in post-war administration met at what was called the rock drill. And according to SIGER, the, quote, security was the #1 showstopper. In 2003, DOD paid Bechtel a good sum of money to do an assessment of reconstruction in Iraq. And Bechtel told DOD in its report that Iraq's deteriorating security situation would cause reconstruction costs to skyrocket. The UN said a similar thing in the summer of 2003. So the administration was not caught by surprise on this. This was something I can only assume that they chose to ignore. And they really ignored it at the peril of the reconstruction. SIGER has estimated that half of the cost of our reconstruction program in Iraq, half of the $50 billion that we spent, went to security, to responding to the security situation. So too with the lack of coordination. SIGER's report contains repeated references to the failure of our agencies to cooperate and coordinate. It's really stunning, and I've listed a number of examples in my written statement, but it starts with the fact that the management of reconstruction changed hands 4 times in 2 years. And in 2004, the 2 key agencies responsible for the reconstruction work, the DOD Office, Project and Contracting Office, and USAID, SIGER says, were barely on speaking terms. And in December 2006, the Iraq Study Group said, quote, there are no clear lines establishing who is in charge of reconstruction. And that's 4 years into the reconstruction. Lastly, there's the failure to include the Iraqis in reconstruction. And Senator Collins spoke to it a little bit as her 4th point. I have a list of these failures cited by SIGER in my written statement, and it includes such items as the fact that we never discussed with the Iraqis the choice of a new defense minister, for example, that the CPA largely left Iraqi lawyers and judges out of discussions about how to reform the legal system. We built expensive projects that the Iraqis didn't want and can't use, and we created a court system that, according to SIGER, the Iraqis can't even recognize. There are many powerful lessons learned from the Iraq Reconstruction Program. My fear is that many of these lessons were ones we already learned, we already knew before we went into Iraq, but the administration chose to ignore them. And frankly, I don't know if there's a meaningful fix to that kind of problem. So hopefully, through the work of this Commission, we'll find out. And I thank you very much for your excellent work and for the work of your people and the danger that they put themselves in to do the good work that you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And we will include all the statements for the record that have been submitted by all parties at this hearing. Next, we have Commissioner Robert Henke.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman, I thank you very much. I'm honored to be a part of this commission and to undertake our nationally important work. I applaud each of the senators who testified this morning, not only for their thoughtful remarks today, but for their longstanding public commitment to transparency and good government. Each of the commissioners here brings a tremendous professional background and a diversity of views and experiences, but what we share in common is that same commitment to transparency and integrity and to carrying out the functions of government both effectively and efficiently. In a short span of time, this Commission has established a bipartisan, deliberate, and rigorous approach to the large task presented to us. With these commissioners and the staff we have, I have no doubt that we will deliver a product worthy of our legislative mandate and the attention and hopefully the action of the Congress. I applaud the SIGGR, Mr. Stuart Bowen, and his colleagues for their Herculean work and tremendous public service that they have done. They have produced over 250 audits and inspections and over 370 investigations. Many would consider this prodigious work product to be sufficient, but these professionals have taken the time to think critically about it all and write it all down and distill it into what we can do to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes the next time. Their Hard Lessons volume is the culmination of that fine effort, and it is a compelling and even embracing and vitally important read. As Hard Lessons points out, every president since Harry Truman has faced a contingency operation on his watch, one that required the intertwining of both military and diplomatic civilian resources. So it is a question of not if, but when our military and diplomatic resources and national will are to be called upon again in stability operations or humanitarian relief or reconstruction as in Iraq. Undoubtedly, this future effort will require significant contracted support, whether reconstruction or logistical or security. We can and we should debate the appropriate mix of contracted support or the suitability of contracting some or all functions. What there is no debate over, however, is that when we contract for necessary functions, we must do so in a way that reflects comprehensive preparation, complete support of operational plans, crisp execution, and interagency processes that work to bring all instruments of national power to bear. All this, and with full transparency, economy of effort, and great respect for the taxpayer's dollar. If we do our work well, this Commission will focus on what changes we must make now and going forward so that we get it right this next time. I welcome the testimony of our witnesses and look forward to their important lessons learned.
Thank you, Commissioner Henke. Commissioner Charles Tiefer, please proceed, Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a professor of government contracting at the University of Baltimore Law School, but more importantly, as a professor of government contracting at the University of Baltimore Law School, but more importantly, as a former general counsel of the House of Representatives who since 1979 has worked passionately for investigative hearings, I'm pleased that the Commission is holding our first of many such investigative hearings today. Our objective with these hearings is to go beyond general policy hearings, useful as those are, and to hold hard-edged hearings on current waste, fraud, and abuse. Controversies that often involve a spotlight on particular erring contractors, like the log cap contractor Halliburton KBR for its billing the taxpayer cost plus for meals never served, and Blackwater for Nizer Square. And in this regard, I am pleased to announce that the Commission's next hearing will be on the log cap program. I am pleased at the leadership of my chair and all my colleagues in setting this important next hearing. Our hope is to hold it in the very near future, and the details will be forthcoming in due time. Today, we are looking at the SIGGR Hard Lessons report. As a professor who's written at length on this, I can say this report is the gold standard of official investigative history. Chronologically, after Baghdad fell, Ambassador Jerry Bremer was brought in. The report tells how Iraq Reconstruction, from then to now, got, quote, enormously burdened by waste, unquote. This was the result of disastrous lack of coordination and even more. This was tolerated and sometimes ratified by the Bush White House. Ambassador Jerry Bremer was brought in by Vice President Cheney's staff. And this fits what Secretary Powell said in his historic interview by Siger, which was that the Vice President seemed at times to run his own National Security Council about Iraq matters. Once Bremer comes in, he disbands the Iraqi army, which turned out to jumpstart the insurgency, and he orders a deep de-Baathification, which decimated the Iraqi ministries. Did the President rein in Bremer? No. He ratified those disastrous steps. As Secretary Powell told that historic interview, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice explained that the White House would, quote, have to back Jerry, unquote. Have to back Jerry. A key Siger conclusion tells our plight going forward from 2009. Quote, the deterioration of poorly maintained infrastructure projects after transfer to Iraqi control could end up constituting the largest source of waste in the U.S. Reconstruction Program. In the afternoon session, we may learn more about the progress of ongoing reviews by the Department of Defense Inspector General that involve questions of payments of billions of dollars. I look forward to the testimony today.
Thank you, Commissioner Tiefer. Now we can get back to our primary witness and testimony of the Special IG for Iraq Reconstruction, Stuart Bowen. You have your deputy, Ms. Ginger Cruz, with you, and I know you have staff here that you will introduce. One of the things I want to share that I was compelled by was in reading your various testimonies in the past. About a year ago, you testified before a committee, and one of your introductory paragraphs said that you just returned from your 19th trip to theater. Now, that's about a year ago. So if we add all this up, we're in the 20s. And I know you're going out again later this month. My point is the territory. A lot of the decisions are made back here, but the implementation of those decisions and the funds that are spent occur in Iraq. And the only way a leader or leaders who are responsible for products such as hard lessons can write a product like this and organize a product like this is to have walked that territory where they're leading. And one of the things I find most compelling as I look at the results of your work is knowing that all the projects in here, people like yourself and Ms. Cruz have gone out and looked at, have talked to your staff and the like, and I commend you for taking such a hands-on approach to leading this organization. And with that, Inspector General Bowen, please take it away.
Thank you, Chairman Tebow. Thank you, Chairman Tebow, and members of the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the fourth Lessons Learned report, Hard Lessons, the Iraq Reconstruction Experience that my office has produced over the last 3 years. I'm joined here at the table by my Deputy Inspector General, Ginger Cruz, and to my left are my Assistant Inspector Generals, Brian Flynn for inspections, Dave Warren for audits, and John Novak for investigations. They remain available to answer questions as they may come up. I also thank the Siger staff who worked so hard to produce Hard Lessons, especially my lead writers, Vicki Butler and Chris Kirchhoff, and my executive editor, Colonel J.R. Martin and Senior Editor Barbara Wolfson. 35 SIGGR staff are in Iraq right now, as we speak, carrying out our oversight mission. Auditors, inspectors, investigators, bearing up under the challenge of carrying out the oversight of the $5 billion left to be obligated, yet to be put under contract in Iraq. So there's plenty of oversight work to be done today, and they are doing it. This report is dedicated to them and to all in Iraq who served and gave their life, especially one of my auditors, Paul Converse. Hard Lessons, as has been talked about, is a detailed account of how the United States undertook an enormous rebuilding program after planning for a very small one, and how it was discovered through hard lessons, through difficult experience, through waste, that the United States government does not have either the structure nor the resources to take on such an enterprise. It's true today as well, and that's why this report is compellingly important for this Commission and for the Congress and for the country as the effort in Afghanistan expands. $32 billion already appropriated to Afghanistan, top of the $50 billion in Iraq, more to come, certainly for Afghanistan. Hard Lessons answers many important questions about the Reconstruction program, but let me just lay out 5 right off the top. How and why did the scope of the Reconstruction program expand so rapidly in 2003? Initially, it was set up to address really 2 things. As Duff Zackheim remembers very well, he was party to some of these discussions back then, and he knows that it aimed at preparing war damage and addressing potential humanitarian disasters, not a large-scale reconstruction program. The President approved such a program on March 10, 2003, but then by May, that had changed, and an occupation had begun, and a program to spend $20 billion was unfolding. What was the genesis of the decision to disband the Army? A question much talked about ever since it was rendered in that late spring of 2003. Hard Lessons provides clear answers on that question. How did the Reconstruction program respond to the growing insurgency? It's laid out in detail. Ambassador Negroponte essentially stopped that $18 billion program and reprogrammed it over the course of late 2004 and 2005, moving the money to where it belonged, security. How much waste and fraud was there? There was a lot of waste, billions of dollars in waste. And you see up here on these easels pictures of some of that waste. Khan Bani Saad Prison. Brian Flynn was out there visiting last spring, and what he found was $40 million wasted. A prison the Iraqis didn't want, a prison the Iraqis refused to accept, a prison that will never hold any prisoners. We've heard earlier Senator Collins talk about the Fallujah wastewater treatment plant. Brian and I went down there last August. It's making progress now. It started 4 years ago. It will probably provide good service, but as our inspection points out, for the natives of Fallujah, that's a problem because what was not included in the contract was connecting their houses to the sewer lines. They're going to have to do it themselves. That's a disastrous outcome. The Baghdad Police College, Brian and I also have visited a couple of times, and it was and remains a problematic project, although much better today than when we first went. How can we learn from the Iraq experience? Well, that's why I'm here, why we did this report, why we began a Lessons Learned initiative 3 years ago. And we have 13 recommendations, 13 lessons that aim forward, that look at ways that, especially in Afghanistan, the United States can restructure and resource its effort so that Khan Bani Saad doesn't happen again somewhere out near Kabul. The overarching lesson, as I've said, is the United States government had neither the structure nor the resources in place to mount the major contingency relief and reconstruction program it took on in Iraq in mid-2003. Thus, for the last 6 years, we've been on a steep learning curve. The U.S. taxpayer has paid for a wide array of programs and projects in Iraq, ranging from the training of Iraqi army and police to building and repairing the country's infrastructure in the oil, electricity, water, justice, transportation, and health sectors. Appropriated funds have supported programs to build democracy, enhance the rule of law, improve the ability of Iraq's national, provincial, and local governments to execute their budgets. Some of these projects have succeeded. As we can see on these easels, some haven't. But there are some successes up here. I was in November out at the Anbar Rule of Law Complex, $21 million well spent. Late in the game, but well spent, bringing justice to Ramadi, a place that until a year ago was the scene of significant insurgent activity. And next to it, the pipeline exclusion zone. I've called that the single best investment that the United States made in any project. $34 million to keep the pipeline safe. And the result? A year without any successful attacks on these pipelines. Whereas, as we reported over and over again in our quarterly reports, those pipelines were taken out over and over again from 2003 through 2007. The central issues raised in this report are: why did the U.S. reconstruction effort so often fail to achieve its goals? And what can our government do to ensure that it has the capacity to manage future contingency operations? Hard Lessons addresses the first issue by reviewing the chronology of the reconstruction effort and examining the challenges our government faced as the rebuilding program expanded from the $2.4 billion envisioned by pre-war planners to 25 times that much. The report addresses the second issue by identifying 13 hard lessons we must learn from the Iraq Reconstruction experience. We divided them up into principles and then application. The first principles for contingency relief and reconstruction operations begin with the obvious one. And indeed, some of these sound obvious, but nevertheless they are lessons learned in Iraq, so we have to spell them out so they may be applied as we work prospectively to reform. Security is necessary for large-scale reconstruction to succeed. One of the biggest surprises about the Iraq program is that a $20 billion effort went forward, full steam ahead, as an insurgency exploded all around it. That's why the Fallujah wastewater treatment plant isn't done yet. It was supposed to be done 3 years ago. It won't be done until September of this year. Why? Security. Indeed, as we learned when we visited that site in August, several contractors working on that project had been killed in the course of carrying out, including someone working on overseeing it for the government. Developing the capacity of people and systems is as important as bricks and mortar. This was not an emphasis in the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund. The Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund sought to spur growth by building big projects, electricity. There were supposed to be 5 large water treatment plants. There are 2 instead. The focus was not on helping governance develop, helping agriculture. Almost no focus on that early on. Helping to focus on sustainment, an issue that SIGIR started to focus on in 2005. And now is a significant focus on capacity building, something we started focusing on in 2006, and now is a significant focus. Hard lessons learned, but they need to be part of a program at the beginning. Soft programs serve as an important complement to military operations in an insecure environment. Well, that's the core of General Petraeus's counterinsurgency strategy that he applied effectively in 2007, along with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. It worked late in the game. Programs should be geared to indigenous priorities and needs. We've heard that discussed earlier. Ms. Kostaitis raised it, the need to engage with those in charge, those with leadership, those who are there in the host country where a contingency operation unfolds, so that you build what they want and not a prison in Diyala province like Khan Bani said that they don't want. Reconstruction is an extension of political strategy. That's also an intuitive reality. But what it means is don't build projects for building projects' sake. Build projects to advance U.S. interests. Organizing the interagency system for contingency relief and reconstruction operations is the next more applied focus of our lessons learned, and it begins with recognizing what we've already talked about today, what each of the commissioners has pointed to, what the senators identified. There needs to be a more effective framework for managing contingency relief and reconstruction operations established, an executive authority below the President that can ensure their success. When I visited with Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus and their predecessors, Ambassador Khalilzad, General Casey, the message I kept getting was the difficulty inherent in a war zone, in a contingency, of integrating military and civil operations. They did the best they could, and they made a lot of progress over time, but there were no structures in place at the beginning. There was no unity of command, which made unity of purpose, unity of effort very difficult. That is key, and I think an overarching central lesson from Iraq. Uninterrupted oversight is essential to ensuring taxpayer value in contingency operations. I landed in Iraq almost exactly 5 years ago on my first trip. I leave on my 22nd later this month. What I saw troubled me right away. The CPA put my office unwittingly, I suppose, right next to the controller's office, and there I saw duffel bags full of money being carted out the door. I knew this was a huge problem, and then walking the halls that same day, I heard someone lean over to another and whisper, "We can't do that anymore, there's a new Inspector General here." Well, that's a sign that for a year in Iraq there had been no effective oversight, and there really wasn't. As a matter of fact, I remember coming to the Controller Zakheim's office soon after I returned from that trip with the head of DCIS, and I said, "There's a fraud problem in Iraq and it needs attention. DCIS needs more money." And it didn't take 30 seconds for Dov to say, "I approve $10 million to go immediately to support more investigators." You know, I think there's much less of a fraud problem today, but we are living with the consequences of that. Chapter 21 in Hard Lessons gives you the grim story of two egregious examples, the Bloomstein conspiracy and the Cockerham case. And the epigraph from that chapter is from Robert Stein, who's now serving 9 years in prison as a result of our investigation. He says, if there'd been an IG in place ahead of time, perhaps I wouldn't have traveled down the path I did. An integrated management structure and management information system are necessary to effectively oversee interagency reconstruction efforts. This means don't outsource so much. You need to have a quality assurance personnel trained and ready to go, contracting personnel trained and ready to go to carry out the important job of management oversight, different from IG oversight. We report what happened, but if this is done well, you don't get so many of these reports that you see on the easel here. Outsourcing management to contractors should be limited because it complicates lines of authority. The flip side of what I just said, the story of PMO is an outsourced organization. Dov was just talking about because this was an ad hoc approach, as we've emphasized over and over again in this report, many temporary organizations were created to address a problem. The Program Management Office was set up within a month to manage $18.4 billion, which it, as PMO, never got to manage because that money never came through the pipeline in time. The planning, the segmenting, if you had anticipated all this, you would know how long it takes to contract large amounts of money. You would know what you need to do a quality assurance program. You wouldn't have the Corps of Engineers and USAID saying, we're not going to participate in doing this now because we can't. They demonstrated tacitly in that refusal recognition of this problem, the challenge of doing a startup in a war zone and spending $20 billion. Finally, contracting mechanisms, something that you will examine in detail, and I think that these are applicable to Afghanistan right now, and this is an old recommendation from our second Lessons Learned report on contracting, and that is the United States should develop new wartime contracting rules that allow for greater flexibility. We called it the CFAR in our contracting lesson learned, the Contingency Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, Title 18 of the FAR has the guidelines in there to do it, but you need a trained contracting corps to be able that's ready to come in and carry that out. And we've heard today already that doesn't exist. The Gansler Commission has already spelled that out in detail for the Army. What we recommended in that recommendation and reiterate here is that a simplified contingency set of regulations be developed, and everyone in theater, once a contingency begins, is advised that that's what they use, instead of having USAID's amended regulations, DOD's amended regulations, Department of State's amended regulations, DOJ's amended regulations. The FAR is a modified document by agencies, and that's true in a contingency setting. And that's confusing for U.S. contractors. Think about Iraqi contractors. 90% roughly of the contracting being done today is done with Iraqi contractors. Much too difficult the way it's currently set up. Second, the U.S. government needs a new human resources management system capable of meeting the demands of a large-scale contingency relief and reconstruction operation. That was the subject of our first Lesson Learned report on personnel. The reality is, partly because there was a short stay expected, there was massive turnover throughout 2003, usually 3-month stays. But that continued for over a year, and it wasn't until the embassy took charge and then stabilized an appointments process that individuals started staying for more than 3 to 6 months. It's no way to run a reconstruction operation, of course. The risk of the Reconstruction Stabilization Citizens Management Act, which is a new law passed by the Congress last October, proposes a new structure for doing contingencies, contains within it what I think is a great idea, and that's the creation of a civilian reserve corps. But it's discretionary. I think that that should be a mandatory new creation. Next, diplomatic development and area expertise must be expanded to ensure a sufficient supply of qualified personnel in contingency operations. This also addresses a hard lesson learned in Iraq, that frequently those deployed didn't have the right skills to carry out the missions to which they were assigned. Hard lessons just spells out chapter and verse on that. And echoing our personnel report, echoing our quarterly reports, echoing, frankly, the waste that occurred. And I think that this is essential to ensure that next time a contingency operation is confronted by the United States, that there are personnel ready to deploy who can do the job. And actually, the next time is upon us. It's in Afghanistan, and I think that we can draw upon personnel who gained the kind of experience necessary to Afghanistan from Iraq, and use that institutional capacity to improve the likelihood that that money is used well. As I said, the Reconstruction and Stabilization Civilian Management Act of 2008 is an effective step forward, but there are 3 things necessary to fulfill its purpose. First, the Congress must provide appropriations suitable to meet the RISCMA mandate. Second, more must be done to ensure that the interagency coordination and integration required by RISCMA actually occurs. And third, the administration should work to revise and integrate the civilian and military components of contingency and reconstruction operations. Integration. Ambassador Khalilzad, when we talked to him, emphasized this point. It wasn't coordination so much that was missing in Iraq. There were coordination meetings every day. It was integration, and that's a structural reality that was missing. Integration will lead to unity of effort. It will lead to unity of purpose. It will lead to unity of command, and it will lead to success. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Inspector General Bowen. What we're going to do is go around now, and beginning with myself. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, and thank you for the commitment of the number of auditors that you have on site. You used the word 35 auditors, and being an auditor and liking to play with numbers as you were talking, it was shared earlier that there's somewhere in the neighborhood, depending who you cite, between 180,000 and 200,000 contractors on the battlefield or in the country, and 160,000 military. If you put all that together, give or take a few thousand, the number kind of comes up to about 350,000. And thinking in terms of 35 auditors on the ground and 350,000, that's an auditor for every 10,000. And people can think a little bit about the dispersal in Iraq. It's a big country, and there's this expression, forward operating base, where the action is primarily. And the number when I was over there that was shared with me is there are about 80 of them. And where I'm coming from is within your report and in your comments where you say we're living with the consequence of prior wrongdoing, which I take to mean we are aggressively sorting it out and the like. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your staff that is doing investigative work of fraud and wrongdoing. And I'd like to ask the question because I know there's a growing backlog of cases that need to be resolved. And what I would like to discuss with you is what would be the impact if that portion, and I'm going to ask you to share that, of those 35 auditors that are pursuing fraud and evaluating fraud and trying to work through that inventory of cases was substantially increased. Can you keep them busy in terms of not having them trip over each other and having a caseload that maybe you can shorten the span from what might be years to 1 or 2 years to bring those home and publicize those cases where there's been wrongdoing? Can you share a little bit with that?
Yes, sir. The investigative part of our effort, we have auditing, inspection, investigation. The investigative arm of my office has expanded by over a third over the last year, exactly because of this issue that you're pointing to, that investigations take a longer time to develop. They are more complex. First and foremost, you're working in a war zone. Second, in Iraq, it's largely a cash environment. Thus, there's, as most fraud is broken in the United States through electronic means, that's not the case over there. And third, it took a while for people to really, whistleblowers to really start coming forward, and they have been. And as a result, we have 72 ongoing cases. From the cases we've already done, we have obtained 19 indictments, 14 convictions. 5 of those individuals are in prison, and the remainder, 9, await sentencing. As I said, Chapter 21 spells out all the convictions that have been achieved by the law enforcement entities, and we work closely with CID and the Army Investigative Division for over there, as well as other entities. But I've got John Novak, my Assistant Inspector General for Investigations. He has spent a lot of time in Iraq. He is going to be adding 4 more investigators over the next quarter as a result of support from Ambassador Crocker to expand our team up to 10. And I think that's reflective of the environment, the investigative environment. But John, would you address that a little bit, please?
Yes. Yeah, good morning. The staff that we have, first I would mention that the jurisdiction, the impacting of the number of staff that we had was impacted by the expanded jurisdiction as of beginning of last year. Prior to last year, SIGAR's sole responsibility for criminal investigations was IRF funds. And so that's, just basic reconstruction. That beginning of last year, that was expanded to the security forces funds, the other types of reconstructions funds. So our jurisdiction expanded broadly, and at that time is when Stuart Bowen expanded our staff. We increased the numbers overseas as well as domestically. Several of the cases have been progressing. Stuart mentioned that we have 14 convictions. In the last year, 10 of those, we received 10 of those convictions in the last year. The program has been steadily expanding. We're anticipating over the course of the next year 25 to 30 additional indictments from 15 different investigations. So the cases are blossoming. There are spin-offs of the cases that we're developing now. And I think that the staff is sufficient at the moment to take those on.
So your view is that you have ample staff for the existing workload you need, and if, as Senator McCaskill was sitting where Ms. Cruz was sitting and said, you've got to come and ask for funds for these types of activities if it will strengthen the program. But you're saying the program as presently constituted, you're comfortable with?
As of right now, if the caseload continues to expand, which it may, then it may be appropriate at that time to come back for additional staff.
Well, the one area where we could use more resources, and that it's a joint investigative audit effort that we have kicked off. It's carrying out our forensic audit mandate, and that takes, as you know very well, Mike, that, an auditor investigator and the technological tools available to review billing statements, receipts. Specifically, to look for double billing. We've got a team that's going to Rome, New York, DFAS, and Millington, Tennessee, and elsewhere to generate what I expect will be a burgeoning caseload. So as John was saying, under our current caseload, things look pretty good. But I think as our forensic auditing effort really kicks in this spring, you can bet that we're going to have a lot more cases.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'd simply sum up with the statement that one of the things this commission would be keenly interested in is identifying where additional resources could be applied, and we'll come back and talk with you more. I'd like to explore quickly what I wrote down in your lessons learned, which is secure the battlefield first, work with the host country to make sure it's the right project, and then properly contract for, manage, and deliver. And you have all these examples where it didn't happen. And if I'm industry, if I'm a contractor with one of those examples, I might come in and say, I don't know. I might come in and say, well, I signed the contract. I knew there were security implications, but they told me get out and do it. So I'm following the contract. Now look what happened. That may be a stretch, but that is one side of it in terms of evaluating it. They're accountable, and they should be held accountable. I'm, from a systemic viewpoint, very interested in yes, these are the lessons learned. Yes, this is what we're going to do. What do we need to do to bring the organizations together effectively to do the planning, to achieve the security, to assure that we're working with the Iraqi government and that they have the commitment to work with us. Through the report, I'm sensing, and through your testimony, there's a real need to improve the process. There are lessons learned. What can we initiate now in order to assure that as we go into Afghanistan, if other contingencies occur, we don't recreate the same exact situation?
I'm going to allow Ginger to address this. She's been to Iraq many times and is looking to this issue now.
Thank you. There's two things that SIGIR has considered over the years, and one of them was the lack of conditionality that was placed on the $50 billion that we spent on reconstruction. And although it was discussed about 2 years ago, it was not really pursued. And so one of the areas that might be considered moving forward is this issue of conditionality, because that would allow the Iraqis then to have some vested interest in the outcome of the projects that we gave them. And in so many cases, when you're talking to Iraqi officials today, they'll say it's a free gift, and sometimes it isn't the right gift. It isn't something that we could use. Perhaps it was too technologically advanced for the staff to be able to run it, and they don't have the capacity. Maybe they can't get the parts, or they can't get the chemicals needed to run a particular water treatment plant. And so it becomes very difficult for them to sustain a lot of the programs that we unilaterally perhaps decided to build. So I think conditionality is something that really should be considered. The other thing is Congress has already started to move towards the matching funds concept. And the last National Defense Authorization Acts has begun to put in requirements for matching funds. There is some confusion right now as to what do they mean by matching. Does this mean that all of the money that Iraq puts towards infrastructure projects is considered its match, and then you put that against how much the United States is putting in? That could cause problems because it's not really holding people accountable. And one of the areas that people are afraid to get into is commingling of funds. Do we want to have projects where you say the Iraqis will put in this percentage, the United States will put in this percentage, and we'll both have a vested interest in the outcome? There's been a reluctance to look at that because it's a messy contracting process, but it's certainly something else that we would consider an appropriate area for exploration by the Commission.
Thank you, and it's something we'd consider. I'd like to move on to Commissioner Irvin. Clark?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for those remarks. There are a number of quotations in hard lessons that I think all the commissioners found to be very, very compelling and arresting, and that perfectly capture many of the lessons that are at the heart of your work over the years. And one of them is a quotation that you referenced, General, in your remarks, and that is that the lack of unity of command in Iraq meant that unity of effort was seldom achieved. Too often programs were designed to meet agency goals rather than U.S. national interest. And I want to ask a couple of questions to explore that and to get at the larger issue of accountability that Senator McCaskill raised. It is, as you well know, a typical Washington response to problems to propose organization chart changes. And many argue that the key lesson to be learned from this is that we need a completely new governmental structure to deal with contingent operations, which we know that we'll be engaged in for some time to come. Now, that said, one could argue that the National Security Council is the interagency process that was designed years ago in the 1940s, 1947, precisely to see to it that State, DOD, and AID in this instance work together in pursuit not of parochial goals but overall national interests. And so I want you to talk a little bit about why you think the NSC process did not work here, and whether properly structured, and I want to ask a follow-up question outside of structure, but whether properly structured it might have provided the answer to prevent what happened in Iraq from happening in the future.
Several reasons why it didn't work. First of all, it does not possess inherent power to make decisions that are controlling over the departments. Second, the process that they were engaging in was superseded by NSPD 26, which put the Department of Defense in charge of the Reconstruction program in January of 2003. But you're asking a larger question: is how do you get to unity of command, unity of effort, and the answers, while everyone complained about it, were somewhat mixed. One quotation from General Petraeus says, "An ambassador will never work for a general will never work for an ambassador." So does that end the discussion? No, that doesn't end it. There are several ways to move forward, and the Congress has laid out one in the RISCMA, the latest act. DOD is pursuing its own stabilization program. It's the third leg of the Army Field Manual under Directive 3000.05. A lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of resources being devoted to it. My concern about those good ideas is they could represent a balkanized solution to a problem of balkanization. Integration is the word. And the executive authority to integrate departments rests not with the NSC, but with the President, per se, the NSC for whom the NSC works. And how the NSC or a new entity, perhaps within it, is empowered as part of the reform process. I think these are solutions that require further exploration quickly, because RISCMA has been passed. The DOD is moving ahead with this, and while there is better integration, certainly than ever before, it doesn't have a coherent framework yet that's guiding it. And that is why in my statement I said it's a problem that exists today.
Let me follow up on that, and I think you began to follow up on where I was attempting to lead you, and that was there's another quotation that I found interesting from Secretary Powell where he said essentially that it's as much a process and a personality issue as it is an organization issue. And you referenced the President. Ultimately, the President has to be in control of this process and ensure that all agencies are working in pursuit of national interest. Can you talk a little bit about the role ultimately that the President has to play in this regard?
Well, the paramount role, obviously, because it's about defining a solution within the executive branch, and the President's the chief executive officer of that branch. But it also must be a collaborative role. And that means working with Congress, because RISCMA is out there. Other reforms will unfold from the relevant committees, I think, this year, addressing some of these lessons, ensuring that the administrative resolution of some of these problems as implemented, 3000.05 at DOD, and the legislative resolution to this issue embodied in RISCMA for now, are coherently connected in a rational framework that can effectively manage contingencies is an issue for presidential leadership. Did you have something?
There's one other point that I would make, and that is that the international community is also examining this issue. And one of the examples of how it could be approached is being undertaken by the British, who have a slightly different system than we do. But one of the things they're trying is something called conflict pools. And rather than appropriating money to the different departments, which ensures that each department pursues its mission and sometimes there is a clash, it puts the money for a conflict in one pool and requires that their equivalent of USAID, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense all agree on the priorities and how that money is going to be spent in a contingency operation. That was not something that happened here, and one of the biggest challenges we have today is while the NSPD put the State Department in charge, yet 85 to 90% of the money was under DoD purview. So you have a real challenge because of the organization. So one of the opportunities might be to look elsewhere at other examples. Not that they've proven that they can work absolutely, but it is certainly worth consideration.
Thank you. Just one final quick question from me, and we can explore this further in a second round, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about subcontracts and the degree of difficulty that you had in looking at subcontracts and the role that they played in overall project management or mismanagement.
That's a very difficult process in contract review. Most of our audits look at the prime contract, but the consequences of failure that we see in reviewing how that prime contractor performed are directly connected to how the subcontractors performed. Indeed, the design-build contractors, the 12 big contractors who received most of this money in March and April of 2004, $10 billion for large construction in Iraq, carried out virtually all of it through subcontractors, some regional, some eventually went Iraqi. But the challenge of the cost-plus contracts, the kind of contract used by the United States in employing these contractors, permitted these subcontractors to fail repeatedly yet still get paid. A cost-plus contract, as I've said in other settings, without definitization, which is what occurred in Iraq, amounts to an open checkbook. And that is the place where significant waste occurred, and why I think that the NDAA's reforms that Senator Collins referenced earlier are critical to ensure that cost-plus contracts get reined in future contingencies.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim, you're up. Dove?
Well, again, welcome, Stuart. You were terrific to work with when I worked with you, and you've gone from strength to strength, I must say, you and your team.
Thanks, Dove.
I am deeply concerned about what you said about learning these lessons and applying them to Afghanistan. We're in the middle of that now. We're in a very different situation from where we were in Afghanistan in 2003, 2004. And so the challenges are great. Some of the lessons do apply. Conditionality, I think, is one. Some may not. Cost sharing. This is a very different country in terms of what resources it has. So could you talk a little bit about what progress really has been made? You know, we've had legislation, we've had your recommendations, we've had all sorts of stuff. But what has already changed on the ground in Iraq that could be applicable to Afghanistan? And on the other hand, what has not changed and desperately needs to? I mean, give me your top three that we must absolutely do right now in order to have a very different situation in Afghanistan than we developed in Iraq.
Well, in our latest quarterly report, which was issued last Friday, our 20th, Section 1, first part addresses exactly this question, and that is applying hard lessons to Iraq Reconstruction, but let me then apply them to Afghanistan, because some of them directly link. Let's begin with the PRTs. Ironically, a program that began in Afghanistan that Ambassador Khalilzad brought to Iraq and expanded into something very different. The most salient difference is that in Afghanistan, the PRT personnel is majority military, and thus has a more tactical feel in its support to the brigades there. In Iraq, majority civilian. although with the development of the EPRTs, you have sort of a hybrid of what the original version was. I think through the PRT experience, which our latest audit in this quarterly points out is working quite well at this late stage, what we've learned ought to be applied to Afghanistan, and more specifically, the personnel who gained that kind of experience in the Iraq PRTs ought to be drawn upon to staff, the civilians I'm talking about, to staff those PRTs in Afghanistan. I think working at the village level as they have and are able to do now, the security situation is much better, has shown real success in Iraq, and something that we would all welcome to see in Afghanistan. Second, I think that the contracting mechanisms in Iraq have improved over time through JCCI. Of course, it's JCCIA, the Joint Contracting Command Iraq-Afghanistan, but the Afghanistan side needs to be staffed up and strengthened. That's what I've been told, and I think that's what you all are about, addressing contracting in Afghanistan and getting the staff they need and the people they need with the right experience they need. And again, the personnel issue applies here. We've got contingency contractors with experience who've been through a tour in Iraq. Let's use them in Afghanistan. And I think of what not to do. Third, what to do is to ensure that the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction has the resources he needs to carry out the oversight. It's a 7-year-old effort there, as Ms. Castillo was saying, and his office has just created last year. What not to do? Don't replicate the weak quality assurance that has characterized the effort in Iraq. That means quality assurance is a buzzword. It means government experts going out to sites to check whether what's happening at that site is what the contract expected. Pretty simple. The evidence of its failure is up here, some of it on these boards, these pictures. We don't know, first of all, really what has happened with the $32 billion for the most part that's been used for reconstruction in Afghanistan. That's something that the Special Inspector for Afghanistan is going to start reporting on. But nevertheless, moving forward, quality assurance is hugely important. Matter of fact, if there's one core rule out of our program management report, lessons learned report, it's that a good quality assurance program, the government, that ensures that a contractor has a good quality control program, the contractor's duty, equals a good project. It's not rocket science, but it's difficult to do in a war zone.
There's one more thing that I would add, and that would be two things, actually: outcomes and strategic plans. It's a recurring theme in all of the audits that we do, and Dave Warren and Glenn Furbish and the team of our auditors are constantly saying that. A lack of a strategic plan that goes beyond this budget cycle, that goes beyond what we're trying to do today. And one of the things that we constantly had trouble with in Iraq was the orders were very short-sighted, and if you would have told the Iraq Reconstruction officials back in 2003 that they had 5 years and $50 billion, a great likelihood would have been that they would have planned much better and been able to execute much more solid decisions in the course of that. But instead, it's waiting to see what budget you get and then reacting. In Afghanistan, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction just put out his report last week, and one of his major findings is a lack of a strategic plan, a lack of an understanding of what is the intended outcome. And our great fear is, before we go pouring more money in, we really need to know, what are we trying to accomplish? How do we measure if we're accomplishing it or not? And at what point do you turn off the spigot so you're not pouring money into a black hole without really knowing what the outcome will be?
You know, one of the things you just said is that we have to get people who are already experienced out to Afghanistan. Meanwhile, State has a reconstruction office, very well-meaning. They don't have too many people that are part of the team that they're trying to put together, this contingency corps. Are you satisfied that we have, as a government, responded sufficiently well in our personnel management systems, OPM, which in my view is critical to all this? Do we have the wherewithal to send the kinds of people out to Afghanistan, or Iraq for that matter, that you say we should? And if we do not, what do we do? Do we legislate? How do we bang these people on the head to get the right people to go out there?
No, I'm not satisfied that we have a system now in place that will meet that mission. And that's why I raised the concern earlier that the RISCMA makes the Civilian Reserve Corps discretionary. This is something that the President said that he wanted in NSPD 44. Civilian Reserve Corps is not a new idea. It's a 5-year-old idea, as a matter of fact, 4-year-old. But there hasn't been sufficient funds put forward to support the creation of such a system, and really a strategic plan for developing and implementing it. And that's why, with respect to this new act, that lays a framework, a good framework, I might add, for addressing some of the problems we're talking about, this needs to be made mandatory, the Civilian Reserve Corps, and there needs to be some money behind it to ensure that there's the capacity to carry out this mission.
And since everything seems to come down to money, you haven't really mentioned, in your report you do, but you haven't mentioned here for the record, how do you evaluate the role of OMB in the last few years, and what would you change about the way they operate?
Well, the Iraq program itself was unique in the sense that it was done through supplementals. I mean, this was sort of like, and by definition, instead of being done through the regular budget process, it was, quote, off the books, unquote. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but that's how it was sometimes described. But it meant it was addressing what's today's problems. It did not fit within, at least appeared to fit within a larger strategy, and I think the supplemental process fed that perception and probable tendency. OMB at the outset of the Iraq program was sort of used as a blocking force on the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund, where certain individuals didn't think money should go quickly, then they would exert pressure to prevent their allocation. Now, perhaps part of it was concerned about effective oversight, and as our report points out, those intuitions proved correct, but just blocking was not the solution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gustitis, please. Linda, excuse me, Commissioner Gustitis.
Thank you. Just on that notion of integration, by the way, there was a piece in the Washington Post today saying that Defense Secretary Robert Gates has formally adopted the concept that national security planning and budgeting cannot be done by the Pentagon alone, and that he supports this whole-of-government concept, that you bring all the parties to the table for both budgeting and strategy. So looks like there might be some progress on that. Do you agree that one of the very key moments in this reconstruction was when we went from the concept of 90 days in and out of Iraq to occupation, and that we did that with no plan for occupation?
Yes, that was a key moment. March 10th is a key day in the history of the Iraq's experience. And that was the day that the President was briefed by Lieutenant General Jay Garner, in charge of ORHA, the first temporary organization set up to manage the reconstruction of Iraq. He was briefed on the transfer by Undersecretary Feith, the transfer to the Iraqi Interim Authority, which was expected to occur very quickly. He was briefed by Frank Miller at the NSC on de-Baathification, that it would be undertaken relatively lightly. Appears to have gone beyond that, as our report spells out. And he was briefed by the commander of the engineers, General Strzok, and he pointed out that the Army would be used as a reconstruction corps, kind of a New Deal type civilian work conservation corps that would be commissioned to help rebuild Iraq. Obviously, within 2 months, much of that changed dramatically. And as the epigraph to Chapter 6 in Hard Lessons points out, Ambassador Bremer, the administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority, told us that when he had lunch with the President on May 6th, that the President had changed his mind, as quote-unquote, about a short stay, and instead the occupation unfolded.
And when we talk about accountability then, do we know why he changed his mind on that? Who helped him change his mind on that? Because it's a dramatic shift, and it's really, in my mind, the cause of so many of the problems of Reconstruction, because we have this massive reconstruction being done without any planning for it whatsoever. But do we know why that decision was made?
No, I requested an interview, but was not given one with the President, and that's a question yet to be answered. Our report doesn't answer it.
Okay. On page 327 of your report, you say, quote, "Moreover, those at the head of what quickly became the largest overseas rebuilding effort in U.S. history, which is the Reconstruction, now that we're into occupation, struggled to differentiate between the pursuit of transformational goals for their own sake and what it would take to achieve rapidly the U.S. national objective of a stable Iraq." I think it's a very important and poignant observation, and I think it helps us going forward in Afghanistan. And I think it's the reason we ended up trying to do too much, really way beyond what we were capable of. Had we focused, once we decided to be an occupier, had we focused like a laser on building a stable Iraq and getting out, I think that may have been doable. But we kept working at cross purposes. So much of what we did, and most of this occurred during a lot of the Bremer and CPA years, but we were trying to transform Iraq to a capitalist free enterprise, all the visions that we had of how a country should look and operate. And that's where we got so confused, it seems to me, and unable to stick to stability and leaving that country, stabilizing it and getting out. We got caught up in the ideology of transforming it. Do you agree with that?
Yes, but more specifically, the focus of the Coalition Provisional Authority's vision for Iraq, or achieving the vision of Iraq, was not security. The security plan proposed therein was to create a new Iraqi army of 40,000 over 2.5 years. That dramatically changed within 6 months as the insurgency exploded across the country, and as the rock drill, that preparatory exercise before the invasion pointed to, security was the #1 showstopper, and it stopped the show.
Do we know who made up that list of the IRF fund projects? How was that list decided? What types of projects the IRF funds would be used for?
Well, there were 2 phases to it. One was, or 3, there was a preliminary achieving the vision that gave the overarching categories, and that was produced by the CPA's planning office in July of 2003. And then Admiral Dave Nash became head of the Program Management Office that August, and he and a few others got together and began to develop a program of projects. But the in-earnest development of a detailed project, the one that was eventually submitted in December, was done after IRF 2 was approved by the Congress on November 6th. And so that was between the end of November and December 9th, when Ambassador Bremer submitted the list of projects to
And was this just
Washington.
ideas of the staff that they came up with these projects, or how did they decide to do the wastewater treatment plant, or whatever projects they ended up with?
Well,
Were these their own ideas? I talked about the problem of not reaching out to the Iraqis. What was the procedure that was used to come up with these projects?
Well, it was internally generated with the help from 2 contractors that were employed. As was pointed out earlier, the PMO was a staff of 1 on September 1, so not much to work with, except the Corps of Engineer detailees that Admiral Nash received, and with them they brought contractors. And there were about 15 contractors that came in and helped develop this initial project list. And then after the IRF-2 was approved, there was staff within the CPA that took that initial work and refined it. They also consulted with the Iraqis, but the Iraqis have told us that it was insufficient.
Well, when Congress approved the $18 billion for these projects, did they ask where did these project ideas come from?
I think there was 4 days of debate on the IRF-2 legislation. Some ministries also, let me point out, had projects sitting on the shelf that they were waiting to get done, and so they pulled them off the shelf and put them into the IRF-2 mix as the program unfolded.
I'm very interested in accountability also, as Senator McCaskill pointed out, but whom would you list as the worst contractors in reconstruction? Who would be on your hit list of the worst companies?
Bottom of the class is Parsons.
And they're still a contractor with DOD? Not in Iraq?
Yeah, not in Iraq.
Right.
They've been gone for 2.5 years from Iraq. Khan Bani Saad over here, Parsons project, really poorly managed, poorly reported on. Baghdad Police College, a Parsons project. I visited the 6 barracks there. None of their bathroom facilities work. So the subcontractor installed the plumbing so badly that, and then the repairs were added, made it worse, and so now they built latrines outside the barracks, 2 of them that everyone has to use. I had concerns. Obviously, our audits point out concerns regarding KBR in 2 respects. One is their provision of support to the embassy under LOGCAP. We don't look at the whole LOGCAP contract because most of that is DOD money, supports the troops in the field. But we did look at, upon request of the embassy, how KBR supported the embassy, and we found a lot of problems. They didn't know how many people were living in the green zone, in the trailers that they were managing. Their fuel dispensing program was riddled with errors and made no sense. And their management of the dining facility was also was very poor and well over budget. Now, to their credit, once we raised all these issues, they fixed them. But it wasn't until light was shown that repair occurred.
So that's Parsons and KBR are the 2?
I'm sorry. Other thing I'm concerned about KBR was their oil contract. We just did an audit on that, and that audit spells out a number of deficiencies, especially their failure in the southern region. One of the largest oil reserves in the world is in South Iraq, and the well workover project was not done by KBR effectively. Other bad performers, I would say Washington Group had some shortfalls on water projects, and then next comes Fluor. I think there's some real problems with sustainment on how they manage the Nasiriyah water treatment system. When our inspectors went down to visit it 4 months after turnover, it was operating at 20%. And part of that was because sustainment, which in fact was endemic early on among the design-build contractors, was not addressed. It was endemically unaddressed in the early contracting.
And that's a very important issue going forward in Afghanistan as well.
Yes, sustainment and capacity building.
How we factor in sustainment for anything that we do in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we've done 3 audits on the SIP transfer, another one coming out this spring. And to me, as I've said elsewhere, this could be the locus of the largest waste in Iraq. If what we did build that worked, like Anbar and like the pipeline exclusion zone, are not well maintained, well, that's lost too.
My time's up. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bowen, could you speak to the question of did the capacity exist in the federal government, in any organization or agency, to effectively manage a reconstruction program of $20 billion at the outset of the conflict? In other words, was it malassigned, or did it not exist anywhere where it could have been assigned to effectively oversee a $20 billion effort?
It did not exist. And indeed, the Corps of Engineers and USAID were asked to lead it. And USAID said it could manage a program about the size of $5 billion. And the Corps said something similar. But the most important issue for the Corps was that the Gulf Region Division, the division that now manages reconstruction for them in Iraq, had not stood up yet, and so it simply didn't have the capacity, quite literally, on the ground to oversee projects.
Does that capacity exist today?
In Iraq, for the program that is there now, yes, it does. I think lessons have been learned. I think that the struggles of the reconstruction program evident in this report have a silver lining, and that is that quality assurance programs are much better than they were. Contracting is much more focused. There's much less fraud, and there's much less waste as a result.
If AID and the Corps had been assigned the task, would they still have had to rely on a significant degree of contracting?
If they had decided to take on an $18 billion program, then yes, they would certainly have to rely on contractors. But you know what they do now?
Right.
USAID is, over the last 20 years, has been transformed into an agency that largely relies on contractors. And the Corps of Engineers, while with a big civilian component, about 35,000, nevertheless has a large contractor contingent within it that helps it accomplish its work across the country.
But do they have a larger program management capacity?
Yes, they do. I mean, they have systems. You know, they have IDIQs, indefinite delivery and definite quantity contracts, in place to draw upon for programs. And it raises a good point. As PMO had nothing to draw upon, so it went looking. And Commissioner Zackheim remembers this. They found the Air Force Center for Environmental Quality, AFSE, Efficiency, Excellence, sorry. And I remember when I first landed over there, I said, the Air Force Center for Environmental Excellence is building prisons in Iraq. So I launched an audit to find out, how did this happen? It turns out they have an IDIQ with 25 contractors in place, and that they for the most part, those contractors have done pretty good work. Laguna, an AFSE contractor, has picked up some of the pieces of the Baghdad Police College and put them back together, and ultimately that place is going to train police officers a few years late.
Can you speak to how the decision was made to take that work from AID and the Corps and align it elsewhere? Is it clear to you how the thought process went?
It was very rapid.
Yes.
Matter of fact, there's an interesting epigraph in here from Lieutenant General Pete Corelli, who commanded multinational Corps Iraq. He says, he's roughly paraphrasing him, he says, the CPA, in a matter of days, just pieced together a set of projects, from wherever they could determine, and it was done, his point being, much too quickly. And I think our story points out that the speed within which an $18.5 billion program was planned was proved quite inefficient.
And I think his quote was along the lines of build a big this and build a big that.
Right.
In theater.
That's right.
Kind of leads me to the second observation. In terms of having the right tool at the right time, based on the facts on the ground, IRF 1, IRF 2, largely, I think your report says they were infrastructure heavy, infrastructure
That's correct.
Centric. Can you compare the success record with IRF 1 and IRF 2 to compare that to the CERP, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which existed before, I believe, IRF 1 and IRF 2, and involved many smaller projects more closer to where the troops were at the time?
We've done 4 audits of the Commander's Emergency Response Program, so we've looked at it carefully. 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and we're going to be doing it 2008 this year. And they tell the story of a program that sort of evolved on the ground in Iraq out of seized funds, the money that the troops found, and they found about $1 billion in the palaces of Saddam, and that they asked for permission actually from their commanders, to begin using it to help out their communities, their areas of operation. And they received that approval, and Ambassador Bremer turned it into a program in the summer of 2003 called SERP. It's, I think, largely proved successful in Iraq, although our first audit points out that the guidelines that were initially established were not being followed, and that the files were not well managed.
In terms of controls?
Yes, right. There were a familiar theme from CPI. Just there were not adequate controls over how that money was being used, although it was having an effect. Those findings were addressed by DOD and by Lieutenant General Corelli. And the story of our audits is a story of a program that learned its lessons and got better over time. But also it's a story of a program, as others have said, that went well beyond its scope, doing projects worth, $5 million, and when it was envisioned to be one to do $50,000 to $100,000 projects. And that's been reined in as a result of recent regulatory and legislative work on the Hill. But as a comparison to IRF, I will say that SERP ended up finishing a lot of IRF projects, ironically, because of the security problem in Iraq required, for instance, the water money to be cut in half, the electricity money lost a third, and SERP has come in behind and done a lot of water projects and done a lot of electricity projects.
Could you explain to us the scope of your work in personnel security contractors? As they relate to infrastructure projects, you've done a significant amount of work there.
Yep. And Dave Warren, my Assistant Inspector General for Audit, has been focused on the PSC issue. We started out, I will say, our first review 4 years back was of Aegis. Really the implementation of a DOD contract to provide security to the PMO. And we found a number of problems: unqualified personnel, weapons accountability, issue that came up much larger in a later weapons accountability audit. And but then now we've done. Aegis took a lot of what we had to say to heart, and we just came out with a significant, wide-ranging review of Aegis this quarter, and they've applied those recommendations and thus received a good audit this quarter. Dave Warren, my AIG for Audit, can address it.
Yeah, they have in fact improved, as Stuart said, in that area, and we gave them a positive report that was, I think, as Stuart has said, that shows progress. People are listening to what we're saying, and improved oversight. In addition, we are doing 2 additional efforts this quarter, looking at field commanders' observations with regard to how they see the coordination of private security contractors on the battlefield. Initial work on that indicates that the results of that will be positive with some areas of concern, but it's been going, that project is going well. We are also looking at incident reporting system that was implemented in, I believe, January of this year in response largely to the Blackwater incident. We're going to do a complete scrub of how that program is working. I should also add we are doing a joint audit with the Department of State IG on the Blackwater issue. The last contact I had on that is we are hopeful to have a report sometime this spring on that matter. The key point that I'd like to point out here is that while we're seeing improvement, what we have found during the course of all of this work is that private security contract work is in fact expensive. We did a preliminary piece of work on this that showed some $600 billion has been spent in Iraq to this point on private security contract efforts. In addition to that, our work is also showing that beyond that, there are life support costs that are being provided to contractors that could, in fact, increase that number by, say, $2 to $3 billion. And we're trying to look at those numbers as we move forward in the work. Lastly, I would would say that we undertook this work in response to direction by the Congress under the National Security Defense Act of 08, Section 842. We developed a comprehensive plan in consultation with the other respective IGs. That plan lays out approximately 20 audits to be done, and I've already mentioned the particular efforts that we have underway. The Department of State has already issued 2 reports as part of that plan, and I'm sure they'll talk about that later today.
Okay.
And AID and DOD IG are also working on those efforts.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So that's a nutshell of where we are.
Thank you, Bob. Commissioner Charles Tiefer. Charles?
Thank you, General Bowen, Mr. Chairman. Your report says Reconstruction was grossly burdened by waste. It'll be hard, but I'd like to get some idea of the numbers for that. Looking at the $23 billion in U.S.-funded infrastructure contracting, estimates have said that about 15 to 20% of that went to waste, which would be about $5 billion wasted on or by contractors. I know you're careful about rigor with numbers, but you wouldn't put that $5 billion figure out of the ballpark, would you?
I'd say 3 to 5. It would be the ballpark on that component of the appropriated money. Of course, I don't reach any. It doesn't reach the half of the money, the $25 billion that has gone to security.
We'll come to that. I wanted to ask also. There's $9 billion which SIGER audited, for which the United States was fiduciary, not appropriated funds. And your report quotes officials saying that this was their, quote, bank account for Iraq. You even have a subheading, an entire chapter section about the DFI spending frenzy. What did you find out about the $9 billion?
Well, that sort of began that first day when I landed in Iraq, and I saw tens of millions or hundreds of millions being carted out the door, and I started talking to my Assistant Inspector General for Audit. Then I said, we've got to look at controls. There don't appear to be any, and we began a very extensive and thorough audit, and I put my best auditors on this at the time, and because I knew how important it was. And they interviewed senior advisors at all the major ministries, and the controller, and the CPA controller, be clear, and we and what we found was evidenced in the audit release January 30, 2005, that the CPA didn't enforce its own regulations, is really the core finding, about managing the development fund for Iraq, the money that was used to fund the ministries. And they passed something called CPA Memo Number 4. Very complex and good set of contracting regulations, but our auditors found that they were observed frequently in the breach. But ultimately, the transparency mandate required by the UN and attempted to and embodied in the CPA regulations wasn't met by just putting on a website, a balance sheet of what happened to $400 million at the Ministry of Oil, that it was dispersed, and then very late in the game, the CPA employed an auditor to a private auditing firm to engage in this review, and indeed they went in and on the other side of the fence, what was going on in the ministries, and found it, for the most part, virtually inauditable because of the lack of records. And no surprise there, the ministries turned over twice by the time they got in there. And so the upshot is that we don't know what happened to that money, but we have investigations still going on, and we are cooperating with Iraqi authorities on investigations that they have still going on with respect to some of that money, large amounts of it.
This sounds, although you can't put a figure on it, like several $billion more of waste. I want to go up to the high-level picture, because your interviews, we've had press from the outside of the government writing books, and we've had a few memoirs, but yours is the official account, and you had access in interviews. Secretary Powell held his tongue for years, and you had that historic interview with him. And I want to ask you the significance of what he said, which you quote, about the key point you mentioned earlier, when the decision to disband the Iraqi army was made, which undermined security and in some ways jump-started the insurgency. And as your report says on page 76, when the army was disbanded, Secretary Powell recalled, I called Dr. Rice and said, what happened? Nobody seemed to know about this. And her answer was, we have to back Jerry Bremer. We have to back Jerry. To me, this sounds not just like lack of coordination, but tolerance and even ratification at the very top of that disastrous decision. Can you explain the significance of that exchange?
Well, as a law professor, maybe I'll invoke the rule of optional completeness here, you'll understand, and finish that quote, because I think it adds an important aspect to that story. Secretary Powell went on to say, there was no meeting on it. There was no, gee, is this a good idea? You couldn't even tell who had decided it. I saw Peter Pace, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a little later, and I said, Peter, did you guys know about this? He said, hell no. And the other quote while we're looking at it is the one from General Petraeus, the last paragraph of that chapter. It says, Major General Petraeus later said that the order to disband the Army sparked an anti-coalition sentiment that fueled the nascent insurgency in Iraq, igniting nationalist impulses against the occupiers. Petraeus believed that the order created, quote, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of additional enemies of the coalition. I think those quotations speak for themselves.
Let me ask about more of this unique interview you had with Secretary Powell. He explained that the Department of Defense was inventing numbers of a new Iraqi army as that was started, and that this was for President Bush to believe as it became the prelude to disaster. He characterized the Defense Department this way. DOD kept inventing numbers of Iraqi security forces. The number would jump 20,000 a week. They said, he's now characterizing what they said. We now have 80,000, and I guess a week later, we now have 100,000. We now have 120,000. And he said, Mr. Rumsfeld is briefing this to the President. What is the significance of what Secretary Powell was saying?
Well, what he said was also echoed later on that page by Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, who was commanding U.S. forces on the ground at the time, and by Ambassador Bremer, in charge of civilian effort. Secretary Rumsfeld has explained that those changing numbers were a function of changing metrics. But the upshot of the issue you're raising is about force levels and about responding to the security problem in Iraq. And I think the answer to your question is the surge. The fact is that a larger security presence was necessary to quell the insurgency and permit reconstruction to move forward. And until an effective counterinsurgency strategy was implemented by General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, this issue of the numbers of troops was simply talk. It didn't really address the truth of the need for more U.S. security on the ground.
The surge after billions was wasted, not to mention the loss of life and the other catastrophes. I want to ask about the contracting, particularly how the agencies and their contractors spent their funds. As you noted a few minutes ago, building big design-build projects, cost plus, as you say, with an open checkbook. I'd like to understand how we got from there to the present and future problem that we face, which we may have to hold hearings because it's a current waste problem. The largest source of waste, the sustainment crisis. Why is that the largest source of waste, and how much of a problem is it right now and going forward?
It remains a serious problem, but it's a problem that's being addressed. It is a problem in Iraq because it was not addressed in the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund contracts. The plan was to build it and give it, not to build it and prepare them to take it and provide a bridge that will build their capacity so that they can receive it. That particular motif never figured into the CPA's vision because it wasn't expected to last that long, I would gather. But nevertheless, regardless of how long you expect it to last, if you're going to build, for instance, the state-of-the-art water treatment system in Nasiriyah, then you better know that when you turn it on, that the pipes in the villages that it serves aren't suddenly going to explode because it provides too much pressure to a system that is used to something much lower. To answer your question, is it a problem today? Yes, it's a problem today, but largely because of the asset transfer component to it. There was an asset transfer plan in place until about 18 months ago, and the Iraqis abandoned it. It was working, and as a result, a lot of projects since then have been unilaterally transferred to the Iraqis, which means with not a good sustainment plan. We have actually ongoing. And Brian, why don't you comment? Brian Flynn, my AIG for inspections, is carrying out and has been carrying out a series of sustainment inspections. And so I'd like him to talk for a minute about what he's learned from those visits to projects already finished that have been transferred to Iraqi control.
Actually, I suppose it's a mixed bag. For the most part, we're finding problems with sustainment. Chairman Thibault, you were with me at the Baghdad Police College. You witnessed what was an adequate latrine turned over to the Iraqis that's been vandalized and through neglect is only about 2/3 usable at the present time. But we've also seen some things like we were recently at the Basra courthouse, where we're in the process of turning this over to the Iraqis. They're anxious to have the courthouse, and they bought and are in the process of installing some very nice furniture, so that there's arguably there an element of Iraqi participation in the cost of the courthouse. Same thing is true with respect to the Basra Children's Hospital. The planning for sustainment there is being done by the Project Hope people, by the Iraqi government. It's still a work in process. It's still somewhat behind in completion, but they will actually take possession of it February 7th. We'll be able to see some patients on a limited basis this summer, and the plan is for them to be able to see full patients in the fall. A lot of steps have to be taken for that to happen. So,
can you give just a brief overview of the sustainment program as a whole, what it will continue to look at over the course of this year, and what we in general have found?
I think what we will continue to do in terms of sustainment.
Sustainment, yes.
I'm sorry?
Sustainment program, right. Your sustainment inspection program.
We're looking at about 25% of the projects we look at are for sustainment by the Iraqis. Our normal inspections is we obtain data on the design of a project. We go out and visit the project and look at whether construction is in accordance with the design. We look at planning for sustainment. We look at the contractor's quality control and the government's quality assurance, and then we make a decision as to whether the project's going to meet its intended objectives. We also like to take projects that are 6 months to a year from having been turned over to the Iraqis and look at them and see how well they're being sustained. And that's basically determining the condition at the time of transfer to the Iraqis, and then the condition at the time that we look at it, see whether it's being properly sustained. It is a problem for the Iraqis. We've looked at this point, 4 primary health care centers as an example. Those are not being well sustained by the Iraqi government, and in fact, so poorly sustained.
Being well said. I didn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry, not. But the Iraqi Transition Assistance Office has funded $16 million contract for the Gulf Region Division of the Army Corps of Engineers to work with the Iraqis to do operation and maintenance, to train them in operation and maintenance. And we're finding things there, for instance, lack of people trained to use the X-ray equipment that was turned over to them, out-of-date film for the X-ray machines, and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay.
My time
Thank
is
you.
expiring.
Thank you. Appreciate you staying a little longer,
Sure.
Stuart. We're going to ask you, as we take one more run by the group here, we'll try to move you out so that we can make our 12 o'clock deadline.
Great.
And I'll start that process by simply saying thank you and recognizing that for me, from my perspective, as I've been briefed up on numerous briefings, read numerous oversight organizations, numerous organizational reports and the like, much of what you say I've condensed down into, and we could say a lack of planning, but you know, this commission's about what do we need to learn and put in place so that we don't do it again, and to look back to gain knowledge to the future, not look back to pummel the past, but to certainly recognize it and prevent it. And I see the need for, Ms. Cruz mentioned much better strategic planning. You mentioned don't build projects for project's sake, which is planning. You mentioned, certainly we've talked about working with the Iraqi, in this case, the country, government, to make sure that you don't give them a project they don't want and they walk away from it. But we also talk about what Mr. Flynn just brought up, about the fact that we better be sure they're ready, even if it's a project they want, or it may go lacking or fall down or ultimately come into disuse. And the not replicating weak quality assurance has a special situation to me, because that fits every single project.
That's right.
And it's been found over and over, and there's been an acknowledgement, and yet the question is what is truly being done by the actions, because you can have plans, you can acknowledge the need, you can put in an action plan, I'm going to get it done. And so for all of that, I just wanted to make the observation that kind of all rolls together for me, and thank you. And I'll move on to Commissioner Ervin.
General, returning to this theme of accountability and complementing the series of questions Commissioner Gustaitis asked about contractors, which contractors you hold most accountable to date for our failures in Iraq, I'd like to ask you to do the same thing with regard to government officials. There's been some discussion, considerable discussion of your view of Ambassador Bremer implicitly, but I'd like you to expand upon that explicitly and to expand the list to include other government officials to the extent that you think they bear some responsibility for what's gone wrong in Iraq.
Well, I would refer you first, with respect to Ambassador Bremer, to the epigraph to Chapter 7 from the Powell interview that we conducted last February. Almost exactly a year ago. Jerry Bremer, God bless him, he was never given a set of coordinated instructions from the administration. He went in pretty much on his own. And I think that's true. So I'm not ready here to say it's his fault. What I can say is that there was a plan, as I talked about earlier, on March 10th that was approved And by May 6th, a different policy had been decided upon. And then that how that was executed, is spelled out. I mean, there was clearly some deficiencies in how Ambassador Bremer managed the CPA. He's acknowledged that himself. I think, in retrospect, disbanding the Army is something he wouldn't do again. I think that banning any Iraqi from service in the government at the top 3 levels because they'd been a full member of the Ba'ath Party was a mistake. Essentially fired what security you might have had, fired what expertise you had in the government. You had to start from scratch. You didn't just have to reconstitute ministries, you had to rebuild them, literally. And so I think that there are clearly, as we point out, Secretary Rice has acknowledged there are many things that went wrong and many things that she would do differently if she could. I think, though, that the story of Iraq Reconstruction is the story of a policy that changed dramatically with respect to Reconstruction in 2003, and then changed again, and then changed again. It changed from a focus on infrastructure to a focus on security, with not much building going on under Ambassador Negroponte. And then it changed on a focus on hiring U.S. contractors to hiring Iraqi contractors under Ambassador Khalilzad. And then it changed again under Ambassador Crocker into a counterinsurgency strategy. There's 5 large changes in 4 years. I think if trying to sustain efficiency in the face of changes of that magnitude is simply proved too tall an order.
Thank you. Another issue is uninterrupted oversight, which you stressed. I'm wondering whether you think there ought, going forward, to be an Inspector General dedicated in the future to contingent operations and perhaps a select congressional committee to look at these issues once Iraq and Afghanistan are behind us.
Well, I think there's sense to that, given the frequency with which contingency operations occur, and perhaps that special IG should be focused on domestic and international contingencies. There are obviously hurricanes, Katrina. It would have been nice perhaps to have had a special IG for that. But indeed the Department of Homeland Security created one internally. So yes, I think the experience of Iraq, Afghanistan, Katrina demonstrate that there's been a need for continuous oversight in this kind of environment. Disaster strikes, rebuilding begins quickly. For the last 5 years, it probably will continue.
And a final question for me is, one of the large issues, of course, that we've talked about and that's extensively documented in your report is security, the necessity for security to make reconstruction work effectively. What, in your judgment, is the appropriate mix, military vis-a-vis contractors, with regard to providing security so that these projects succeed?
There's not a cookie-cutter answer here. The fact is that conditions demand what that mix is, but what there needs to be is integration, an integrated decision-making process wherein the civilian component and the military components achieve a unity of purpose, and that requires some form of executive authority. I think that should flow out of reform effort, because I don't think the reform efforts we see now are coordinated enough, integrated enough to yield this kind of outcome.
Another interesting point that we will be facing very rapidly is, as the troops draw down in Iraq, one of the key concerns is the cost of security. For the costs that we've cataloged to date have all been calculated on the fact that we've had roughly 150,000 troops. And when we talk about PSDs protecting the various officials that conduct reconstruction, they do so within a pocket of security provided by the military, and that is a cost that is not actually calculated. So when we say $6.5 billion was spent on private security, that's in addition to all of the sunk costs of all of these troops. So when we go out with PSDs, it's within a pocket of a Stryker group or, you know, the Humvees with an entire group of military. As you take those military away in Iraq, if they continue to do certain levels of reconstruction, especially in the provinces, while they will depend a little bit on Iraqi army and Iraqi police, the question then becomes, how expensive is private security? And the real key is, as long as people know what the cost will be, and as long as they're willing to bear that cost, then that's a strategy that can be employed. But part of the problem is the true costs are not really known. And so one of our fears in 2008 and 2009 is we're going to reach a point where we're going to have to use private security, and the costs could escalate dramatically.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim?
Yes, thanks. We've been talking about huge sums of money. I recall in 2003 having a discussion with a top CPA official who said he was going to be asking for about $25 billion. My notion was probably closer to what the World Bank had said about absorptive capacity of Iraq, which is about a fifth of that. My question to you is, could Iraq really absorb the kind of money we were throwing at it, number one? And how do we think about absorptive capacity for Afghanistan or any future contingency?
Great point. Absorptive capacity is a key issue to think about in deciding how much aid to offer. And I agree with you. Iraq did not have the absorptive capacity for 25 or 18 billion as it came down to, or for that matter, barely 5 at that time. Because, as I said, the Army was fired, most of the senior government was fired. It was essentially a U.S.-driven endeavor, subcontracted out, and that required capacity building, not a focus of the IRF program, and so the absorptive capacity was as low as it's been in the last 6 years, and how it applies to Afghanistan, hugely important question, because this is a country that doesn't have the kind of bureaucracy or operations or resources that Iraq has, and therefore will have a much more gradual or much lower absorptive capacity.
Let me ask you a slightly different question. Right now we have a joint contracting command for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Two-part question. First, in your view, should there be a separate contracting command for Afghanistan? And secondly, should there be a government-wide contracting organization for Afghanistan?
Yes, for sure on the first question. And the focus is going to be Afghanistan. It's headquartered in Iraq. There needs to be a contracting headquarters in Kabul that is its own entity that answers to up the chain for its own actions for what goes on in Afghanistan. I think that your second point I would choose first to implement a CFAR. You know, a government-wide contracting effort would just mean taking everybody out there and trying to get them all around the table and get them to agree to, you know, moving forward and what the contracting strategy is. I think an easier way is say, here are the 10 rules that everyone follows for contracting in Afghanistan. Follow them. That yields a strategy.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dov. Commissioner Kostaitis?
I want to make the point that it wasn't that we weren't warned that these projects were not the best way to go in Iraq. You in your report, oh, I'm sorry. It's not that we weren't warned that these projects weren't necessarily the right way to go in Iraq in terms of absorptive capacity. The U.S., in your report, you refer to the USAID Director, Nastios, who called the list of projects a recipe for disaster.
That's right.
And he didn't keep that opinion to himself. He said it flouted the lessons learned from previous international development experience. He said you need money for elections, for local governance, for the university, for health care. And he got an angry call, you report, from Bremer, speaking of individuals accountable, saying he was trying to destroy the IRF-2 plan. and Bremer didn't heed Nastios's advice, according to your report. So I don't know, what's the fix for that problem? That's personality to personality, and whether somebody's so hard-headed that they don't listen to advice from somebody who has some experience in the real world. So I don't even need a comment on that. It's just an observation. Senator Collins pointed out, and I had this as one of my questions, that you did this in an audit. You found that for reasons of security, mismanagement, cost overruns, that we terminated 1,262 contracts and task orders, either for default or convenience, during the course of Reconstruction. And of the nearly $1 billion in value of these contracts, the government had already paid $600 million, apparently. And some of these projects were apparently near completion, but most of them weren't.
That's right.
So here's the question. How much of that $600 million do we get back, or is that permanently lost?
It's probably mostly permanently lost.
It is.
And this was an issue I started raising early on during my trip when I saw projects like these falling off the rails. I'd say, we got to default.
Yeah.
Stop terminating for convenience, which is, when you terminate a contractor for convenience, you pay all their costs, all their cost of leaving, closing down, closing up shop, and this is a contractor who's messed up. And that didn't sit well with me. And so I started urging for more defaults, and more started to come. But even so, the fact is, unless you paper the wrongdoing very well in the contract file, recovery on a termination for default is a very lengthy litigation process that the Department of Justice usually takes a pass on.
It's an excellent point. You need good contracting practices all along in order to be able to recover.
One additional point that we're finding in our investigations right now is the fact that if contracts were not written appropriately to begin with, which is a prescriptive recommendation, that it's very hard, if not impossible, to pursue that money again. If the contract said, go out and do work on this project, and it doesn't say what you expect from them. Part of the problem that we're having is when we go back with the contracting officers or go back to look for fraud and try to hold folks accountable, we can't, because the contract was written so loosely that the lawyers will say, well, they met the contract requirements. So that's another area that could be looked at to be tightened up.
I just want to thank you for your excellent work. You've done a terrific job, you and your office.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Linda. Commissioner Henke?
Could you expand on the notion of matching funds as it means going forward to Afghanistan? Is there any notion that there will be a matching program of any import?
That's a policy question, so I don't know. With respect to Afghanistan, it's very important policy that has been implemented in the last supplemental in Iraq, and I think should continue to be, to the extent that the United States continues to appropriate funds. Afghanistan, as we've said over and over again, is such a different situation because it's, unlike Iraq, one of the poorest countries, has no natural resources, and so I think the analysis, the policy analysis, is going to be much different.
Okay. Ms. Cruz, could you speak a little bit more about your idea of conditionality and what that might mean in the setting of Afghanistan?
We looked at conditionality as an office when we were doing the quarterly reports, and one of the things that was not really put in place early on, and that in the last 2 years we have seen, is any sort of requirement for agreements by the receiving government to do something in exchange for the project that they're being given. And this is standard international development practice. One of the reasons why the United Nations and the World Bank were reluctant to pour a lot of money into Iraq in the beginning, because part of the point of pouring the money in is not to necessarily build the plant. It's the act of getting that money in there that gets the government engaged, that gets them engaged, lets them understand how to pursue future grants. It's the sustainability question, you know, giving someone fish versus giving them a fishing rod. And so the idea of conditionality was never applied in Iraq. I know it was considered a couple of times, but in the end we gave $50 billion without requiring anything. And so it could be something as simple as requiring the government of Iraq to sign a memorandum of agreement ensuring that they will provide doctors that will operate the $20 million hospital that we are providing for them in a certain province. And while those are things that are now being pursued on an ad hoc basis, if that was done as a condition of the contract, before we will build, before we give you the the $15 billion to develop your Iraqi army and your Iraqi police, you must make sure that the militias are removed from the police and that the types of screening or vetting for the police officers meet a certain requirement. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, both in soft projects and in hard projects, and it's just was never done in Iraq, and it's something that perhaps in Afghanistan would work.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Bob. Commissioner Tiefer.
General, I can't get over the 2 years of intense labor your staff put in and the historic nature of these interviews. If I can ask you about a quote from Deputy Secretary Armitage's interview, which to me sounds like it's the moment where the alliance between Rumsfeld and Bremer, which had gone from bungling to bungling and disaster to disaster, finally cracks. Secretary Armitage said to you about a meeting, Dr. Rice turned to Rumsfeld. She said, Don, would you call Jerry and have him do X, Y, or Z? And he said, no, Bremer, doesn't work for me. She said, yes, he does. Who does he work for? And he, Rumsfeld, says, he works for the NSC. That is, she said, he works for you, and he said, no, he works for you. What did this mean, and what was its significance?
Excuse me, that occurred in the fall of 2003 when another policy change was underway. And that policy change was driven in part by perceptions in Washington about the September 8th Washington Post op-ed that Ambassador Bremer published regarding the CPA 7-point plan for transferring sovereignty to Iraq. It caused alarm bells to go off in certain places in this town, as we point out in the report, and there's dispute, as our report points out, about whether and to what extent Ambassador Bremer had briefed Secretary Rumsfeld about that plan. It also caused the creation of something called the White House Iraq Stabilization Group, and that led to the deployment of Ambassador Blackwell as head of that group to Iraq to review what was going on, and he came back very concerned. And as he says in the sentence preceding the quote you just read, he said there was a very serious estrangement within the interagency at that point, emphasizing again very serious, and I think that quotation reflects that estrangement.
One other quick quote. Some people have found it their favorite. President Bush gave the authority in NSPD 26 to Secretary Rumsfeld, and he says a little later, he's quoted as saying, if you think we're going to spend $1 billion of our money over there, you are sadly mistaken. And as your report notes, at that point we spent $50 billion, eventually. What did you understand was going on when we gave Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld control of Reconstruction, post-war Reconstruction?
Well, I think that was something that the Department of Defense had argued for and discussed in the fall of 2002, well before that actual vesting event occurred in January of 2003, just two months and a few days before the invasion. And I think that is symptomatic ultimately of two things. One, the planning for Iraq was a Department of Defense enterprise. It was an invasion. So, and with that came Phase 4, which is part of any military operation. Phase 4 is about what you do after achieving victory on the grounds. But the next step beyond Phase 4 is what you do about stabilizing the country. And with NSPD 26, the Secretary of Defense secured for the Department of Defense the authority to manage that phase. And as we've discussed, that phase changed quickly because, as the report points out, widespread looting led to widespread chaos, led to collapse of the ministries, and led to the replacement of the gentleman who was engaging in that conversation with the Secretary of Defense, Lieutenant General Jay Garner, who was leading ORHA, the temporary organization, then trying to deal with the looting, to try and deal with the burning ministries, to try and deal with no government, to deal with rioting soldiers. Ex-soldiers, I should say.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And this wraps up this part of the testimony, or this panel. Stuart, there are very few people that can wear the title of being a historian. A lot of us try to say, well, we know the history, we must be the historian. You've walked both personally and through your many products. I'd certainly give you kudos as a true historian, and that's ultimately about as good a compliment as I can give anyway. And this group, this commission, clearly is very appreciative and continues or will continue to work with your exceptionally talented staff, and please pass that on to all of them, our appreciation for their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Thibeault.
That is a bipartisan sentiment.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Thibeault. Thank you, Commissioners.
Live coverage of the first public hearing of the bipartisan commission established to study wartime contracting practices in Iraq and Afghanistan. A break right now, we believe a lunch break, but awaiting official word on how long this break may last. And our coverage, of course, live coverage on C-SPAN, will continue when this public hearing resumes. In the meantime, a couple of items in the news today. The Associated Press reporting that President Barack Obama says that very modest differences should not get in the way of swift congressional passage of a massive economic stimulus package. Mr. Obama spoke today to reporters as he and Vermont Governor Jim Douglas, the Republican vice chair of the National Governors Association, were about to meet in the Oval Office about the plan. Governor Douglas agreed with the president, saying that a stimulus package is essential to getting the country moving again. Also from the AP, President Obama says he absolutely stands by Tom Daschle's nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. The president gave that one-word answer today about the matter during the meeting with Governor Douglas. Specifically, President Obama was asked whether he still backed Mr. Daschle. in light of the disclosure that the former Senate Majority Leader failed to pay more than $120,000 in taxes. Mr. Daschle is the president's second cabinet choice to face tax problems. Again, that from the AP today. Getting word now that this first public hearing of the bipartisan commission to look into